The Rebel Capitalist Show.
Let's transition over into the owner-occupant. So if you're someone who's considering buying a home for yourself and your family right now, or maybe considering selling your current house, what's going through your mind? What metrics would you use to try to determine, yes, I should buy right now, or no, I should hold off and wait, or yes, I should sell right now, or no, I should hold off and wait?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, what is the interest rate on your mortgage and what is your mortgage balance? What does that debt burden look like? So if you refinanced, hopefully you did, and you took advantage of the lowest interest rates in thousands of years, quite literally, then I would try to keep that house because it has a mortgage asset attached to it that cannot be moved and it cannot be duplicated anymore. It has utility and it has scarcity, the two value drivers for anything, scarcity and utility. And so I would try to keep that house, especially if it's in a linear or hybrid market. If it's in a overvalued cyclical market and you're trying to time it and you don't need that place to live or you want to move for whatever reason, then it's a different discussion. But just from a financial point of view, if you've refinanced and if you've got those lower rates, which you probably do, keep it.
Yeah. I think especially if you are very confident about your income or your job moving into potentially a recession. I think that's a big component of it as well. I would be far more likely, I think, to keep my house if my job was on Zoom. If I was an accountant, as an example,
Right.
than if I was a construction worker or if I worked in retail or something like that. That would be
Or
a different calculation.
here's one for you. There's another giant industry, the mortgage industry.
Yeah, right.
So
Yeah, you work in the mortgage
and
industry, it might not be, your income might not be that safe moving
yeah,
forward.
and let me just give you an interesting anecdote about the mortgage industry. Being from Orange County, California, I am intimately familiar with the mortgage industry. I've owned a couple of mortgage businesses over the years. And George, I'll tell you, commercial landlords, office landlords, they absolutely hate mortgage companies as tenants because
Right.
when they're in the boom times, they expand rapidly, they take on a whole bunch of space, and when the rates tick up just one little bit, they go under. I remember, and I think I told you the story of a mortgage company in Orange County, California. On I think it was a Friday morning, they pulled the fire drill, so everybody would go out in the parking lot and get out of the building. There was no fire. They simply laid everybody off once they were outside of the building because they just fired everybody. And that's the way the mortgage business is. It's extremely volatile. It employs a lot of people who at the time made very high incomes during refi boom times, and then that contracts dramatically when rates tick up. So it's that's a big part of it. So if you're impacted by the mortgage industry, those incomes have evaporated now because it's strictly purchase business. There's no refi business anymore.
Yeah. And what would you say to the person? Well, let's go back to the potential buyer. So we talked about, we talked about, you went to the potential seller, right? You said
Right.
keep your house basically
Yep.
if you've got X, Y, and Z set up. So now let's look at the buyer. What metrics should they use to determine whether or not they should buy right now?
Well, we only have three choices: buy, rent, or be homeless. And that buyer should be looking at their rents, whatever rent they're paying now, if assuming they're a renter, not a buyer yet or an owner yet. And they should just assume that those rents are still going to go up dramatically. They might think, well, I've already had 2 or 3 rent increases in the past few years, and they've been pretty dramatic rent increases. And let me just give you an example of that. I mean, these rent increases are the biggest I've ever seen in my entire multi-decade career in real estate, where someone is paying $1,200 a month and they go to $1,600. These are not small rent increases. I mean,
know.
they're huge. And most of the time, the tenants say they're going to move, but then they go out and look and they say, "Hey, we'll just stay. We'll just have to give up a car or a car payment or something. We'll make some other arrangement, take the kids out of private school or whatever it is to afford the house." Because they just can't find anything else. Rents have adjusted up so dramatically. And one impact of all of these institutional landlords, American Homes for Rent, Invitation Homes that have tens of thousands of properties, they are much better at raising rents than mom and pop landlords because they use software, yield management software, and they are relentless about raising rents. You know, if you've ever rented an apartment in an institutional apartment building complex like Kenny owns, right?
Yeah, right.
They're relentless about raising rents. Now they're doing that with single family homes. So what does this mean to investors? Well, it means that rent comps are going to have more and more upward pressure because the better landlords, and I'm not saying they're better in every way, I'm just saying they're better at getting all the yield out of those tenants, right?
But at what point does that give? Because their purchasing power isn't unlimited.
That's true. But what happens is the standard of living is what gives.
Yeah, right.
The quality of life gives.
Yep.
And so I use this example when we were both speaking at Mark Moss's event in Dallas. I shared a couple of slides that showed a property in Jacksonville, Florida, that you could buy for $1 million. It was almost 5,000 square feet. The house was gorgeous, big lot, great location, marble floors. It was beautiful, absolutely gorgeous home. $1 million, almost 5,000 feet. And then I showed what $1 million buys you in New York City. And it was 653 square feet. Not even one bedroom, just a little loft over like a mini kitchen, right? And that's what gives. Well, the point I'm trying to illustrate there is that lifestyle is just reduced. That's what happens with inflation. It hurts most people. It reduces their lifestyle. Yeah. So the tenant in that property is not necessarily the same tenant. It's a dynamic thing. If they can't afford it, they simply move out and they move down. Right. They get a smaller house in an inferior neighborhood, in a school district that's not as good, in an area with higher crime rates, whatever. They just get less. And it's a sad reality of a centrally planned economy that is a kleptocracy, where people, their debt is just, or their assets are just stolen from them through inflation.
Yeah, right. So that person that's considering buying, they've got to look at I always suggest they look at the RV ratio as though they're an investor. And if
Absolutely.
the RV ratio is very, very low, then it's going to be a better financial decision to continue to rent, right, and not to buy, maybe wait for prices to come down, if they ever do. Although, again, that can take a long, long time. But if you're someone who's considering buying in a market that is linear, that is, I would argue, in a red state like Florida or Texas too.
Of course.
That's very important now. Right. Then maybe you consider buying even as an owner occupant if the RV ratio is higher or would make sense from a standpoint of an investor. So I guess maybe connect those dots for the people listening. Why should an owner occupant care about an RV ratio?
Yeah, they should definitely care. And your point is well said. So let's do an example of that. And just for ease of numbers, let's say we're talking about a $200,000 entry-level house, which is almost non-existent anymore. Right, but it's an easy number. Okay. So if you can rent that $200,000 house for less than $1,400 a month, less than a 0.7 RV ratio, okay, you're probably pretty good renting. That's a pretty good deal for you as the renter, right? But you have to understand there is still a lot of remaining upward pressure on rents in the system that has not worked its way through. So if you can renegotiate your lease and get a longer term lease, I would, because expect your landlord to raise your rent. There's still a lot of rent growth coming, okay, or rent disaster coming for tenants, whichever side of the trade you're on. And but if you're paying $2,000 a month or a 1% RV ratio, then it's going to be better to buy almost always. So usually what happens is if the property is below, say, $350,000 or $400,000 today, those numbers used to be lower, in the past. If we were doing the show a couple years ago, I would have given a lower number. But $350,000 to $400,000 or less, almost always you should buy that house. If it's more than that, more questions come up, because the higher the price of the house, the better the rent to value ratio for the tenant, and the worse it is for the owner.
Yeah. So let me say that another way, and just take it to an extreme. If you've got a house that you're renting for, let's say, $3,000 a month, and it's a $2 million home, don't buy it. Just rent it, because you are getting a way better financial deal by renting that house, because the RV ratio is so low. A $2 million home at a 1% RV ratio, you'd want to get 20 grand a month for rent.
Right.
Well, you're renting that for $3,000, taking it to an extreme,
Yeah, that's an extreme, but
don't buy, just continue to rent.
That's the deal of the century. Renew your lease and agree to increase the rent to $3,500 and get a 10-year lease.
Right, exactly. But if that house that you're considering buying, it is a $200,000 house and it rents for $2,000 a month, then it's probably a better deal to go ahead and buy it, even as an owner occupant.
Right.